So let's talk to Stephen in Arizona, who had more questions about concealed ovulation. Stephen, go for it.
Hi. So, as Forrest, it's lovely to talk to you and everything. I consume your content elsewhere, so it's very exciting for me to get to ask you this. Or I didn't know it was going to be this question, but here we go. So, as you were talking about concealed ovulation, I was reminded of an article I read probably 20 years ago about the idea of penis size and breast persistence coming from the fact that we finally stood upright and could see these things until we put on clothes. And I was thinking about the same thing with respect to concealed ovulation, is that once we were standing upright, the vulva wasn't visible. So, or if memory serves, it's not typically. So, and and I've heard about, I think it's a species of baboon or bonobo, where when the males greet each other, they reach out and touch someone. They wank each other to say hello, which is something I think we gave up on a little too quickly in evolution. But yeah, so my where I'm going with this is I'm wondering if overall our sexuality isn't an expression of the fact that we can't tell when a woman is ovulating just to look at her. So if there's access and she's receptive, males are just sort of, let's go for it. Because we're to Christy's earlier point about his dog, we grow up with this idea that if a woman's or a female's an estrus, the males of that species are going to lose their minds trying to get to her to mate. And we don't do that. And it I know homosexuality and other expressions exist across other species, but it seems to me that it kind of opened it up to not only how we interact heterosexually, but in other ways, because we're not necessarily worried about that. That isn't where it might be at the very bottom of the basis of our instinct to say this is the possible result, but because we can't tell, we just go for it. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on that possible hypothesis before I write a paper.
So you just gave me like an hour's worth of stuff to talk about. So I'm going to try to get through it quickly and go piece by piece. And no, you're fine. That's such a huge amount of things you just said. So first of all, in terms of like, the signaling of us standing up and not being able to tell, that kind of this was a similar hypothesis about like why persistent breasts exist, is that this was supposed to imitate a buttocks, because in other primates they usually go from behind, and so your breasts are supposed to look similar enough to a butt to be sexy when we're having sex, like in a missionary position. And then there was another hypothesis that added on that like having large lips was supposed to look like a vulva as well, and like this whole like again, no real consistent evidence for these things that really, but like these are ideas that get tossed around.
I never quite understood that one. I definitely heard that one a lot. So I'm glad to have that at least a little bit sort of pushed back against.
I've never heard a single bit of actual quantifiable evidence. I've heard a lot of people say
boobs aren't just the front butt.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I've heard a lot of people say that, but again, there's plenty of things where they measure breast size and hip size and waist size and all these things and try to compare it to cultural concepts of attractiveness, and we just don't. It doesn't work. And so the what was I saying? Right. So like that's a thing that's kind of up in the air. And then you talk about sexuality and like how we're gonna go and have sex. Humans are, this is the worst word to describe humans. We are what are called persistent breeders, or continuous breeders. Pardon me. We are what are called continuous breeders. Other species are seasonal breeders, so they only have one set of time a year that they can get pregnant. And humans are continuous breeders, which, that's a harsh way to call a person. But we still do have an estrous cycle, so there's only actually about maybe 3 to 7 days a window where a woman can actually get pregnant, even though she could potentially have sex the whole time. And so like that, it doesn't really, we can have sex whenever we want, but trying to tack that down with an evolutionary reason might not work, because there is also the option of it was nice. It felt good. We wanted to do it. And that's what we see like with bonobos, for example. You know, they have sex to say hello. They have sex to say goodbye. They have sex to settle an argument. They have sex to celebrate the fact that the argument settled. It's all the time. And when we talk about the reasonings for these things, there are proximal answers and there are distal answers. So you take something like hiccuping, right? There's no immediate reason for that. There's no proximal explanation for hiccups. There's a distal explanation for hiccups, which is that, you know, a little over 400 million years ago, our ancestors are still in the water, and this gulping behavior forced water over our gills and got extra oxygen. And so now we have this fixed action pattern, this reflex that causes this kind of thing to happen, even though we're well past it. This is a vestigial behavior. And so when we talk about sexual behavior in humans, we can look for a distal explanation and go, okay, so, you know, a 1.5 million years ago during the early Pleistocene, when the climate in Africa was getting drier, and so we had to have sex this way to get across the savannah that way. And like, we can try to pull these things, or we can look for the proximal explanation, which is it felt good and we did it. And like, that's way more consistent. And we see that when we talk about sex for pleasure, or the pleasure of having sex when we're not supposed to, when we don't need to, when we're just doing whatever. Like, we see that not only in humans. Again, we can look out in the animal species and we see countless different examples of, like, you know, anal sex, oral sex, non-penetrative genital stimulation, which is the fancy biology word to say masturbation. Like, we see all of these things. We even see indications, or at least hints of like what could be perceived as sexual fantasy. You know, we see this baboon watches the big bad male baboon have sex with the head female, and then the head female walks by and he gets an erection, he goes behind a tree and he masturbates. And we, you know, maybe you could find some, you know, complex biochemical, the pheromones and the estrous cycle of that and the hormone signaling, or he saw what he wanted to be doing and he saw the sexy baboon chick and he went and knocked one out just for prosperity. You know, like, that's totally fine too. So it's really tough to put that's a great hypothesis. It's a great supposition you've got there, but I can't say that it's any better than just the explanation of we felt like fucking, so we did. And that also ties into other things when we talk about, you know, the weirdness of things like persistent breasts and the weirdness of things like, you know, our the penis shapes and all the things. One of these other weird things that you should take into account when you talk about stuff like this is the female orgasm. Why do females have orgasms? Men, you know, the males don't really need it, but there's a lot more volume when we do, but like all the biochemical things, all the endorphins and all that aren't really super necessary, but at least we can tie something to it. There is a notable quantifiable result of a male orgasm. But a female orgasm, what are we talking about there? What's the point of that? There's a very, 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 very slight increase in the possibility of fertilization that we can sometimes point to. But it's very obvious that it's not necessary for fertilization. It's not necessary for pregnancy. It's not necessary for implantation. It's not necessary to give birth. It's just why? And we can call it a spandrel, just like male nipples. The men needed to have an orgasm, so the ladies got one too. Aren't they lucky? But that doesn't explain the fact that, like, clitoral orgasms are often way easier to achieve than a penetrative orgasm. So how does that make evolutionary sense if that's a thing? And again, just like with breasts, there's a huge amount of hypotheses for this, that this is something that causes this reaction that makes you more likely to have sex. One of the leading hypotheses for a long time about female orgasms was that it exhausts you so that you'll lay down flat and sperm don't have to fight up against gravity and it's more likely to get but that doesn't really work, does it? In the majority of cases of sex, you know, ask any random woman walking around, is that something that goes on, you know, most of the time, that this is the end result for you? So like, it's one of those weird things, and I hate to fall back on this, but this is kind of the point of this whole show, is that this is one of those things where we can absolutely look to other animals and we can absolutely look to other, you know, primates and find things that inform our understanding of our biology, but it does not inform our understanding of why or what's going on in these fine details. Humans are very weird for a lot of reasons.
Well,
so Stephen, I don't know if that answers your question or just kind of murks it up a little bit more.
It should do both.
Yeah,
if
right.
I'm doing my job right, it should do both.
Yeah, it does. But I mean, it I guess from my perspective, it's fascinating to think about, how long we've been here, how different we are from other primates in some ways, and how similar we are in others. And no, it's just fascinating to think about because a lot of stuff doesn't make sense. Like the thing that bothers me the most, because of how it's affected people in my family, ironically, is how bad we are physically at doing certain things like giving birth. And with the women that I've been attracted to, for some reason, and I don't know if this is why or not, because we could have another discussion, but I like women with wide hips. And I don't know if that's some part of my brain saying she's more likely to deliver a baby successfully. But, my great or third great grandmother died shortly after childbirth because her hips were too narrow. And my mother almost died giving birth to my brother, which she loved to remind him of, and that I was the good son because I wasn't any problem. But in all seriousness, things like that, you talked about the back and different parts of the body that it doesn't make any sense that they work the way that they do. So it's just a fascinating thing to think about, and, just makes us realize we're all okay. This is what we are and who we are and how we are, and just ride with it.
And that's a weird thing, is that it comes back to, the cultural expectations and the cultural constructions of sexuality and of what we like to do. Christy can probably speak more to this than I can, but I know for sure that there's links. Like if you grew up in poverty, you're more likely to like large breasts later on in life. And is that a thing where we can say that this is like some symbol of abundance, or is this some other weird thing? You know what I mean? The same way that if you were bullied as a child, you're less likely to have a committed relationship until a little bit later in life. Why is that a thing of disconnection and distrusting, or is that some other you know what I mean? So
and how would those numbers look if we were checking them on a different continent, or 50
Precisely.
years before or later, or whatever else?
Exactly. And so it's just not something that we can always point to, this equals that, therefore, you know what I mean? It's just not that easy.
And if I could just add one more thing real quick, like my great grandparents, talking about social structures and so forth, they got married because they had to. He got her pregnant in 1880. And they got married right away to make the child legal or whatever. And then they had 7 more. And she let him have extramarital affairs. He was a well-known womanizer because she didn't, she already had 8 kids. And it was like, if we're going to have sex, we're going to have a kid. So we got to cut down on this. So she let him be outside of the relationship, having sex, not willy-nilly, but for lack of a better term, so that her life wasn't in danger, not just, because of the time period and everything, maternal mortality was higher and so forth. So the whole structure of relationships and how you negotiated that or navigated that had to be different before we had reliable birth control and ways of controlling family planning. So again, all of it, I love sociology and anthropology, so this is all very fascinating, and I appreciate you letting me ramble and answering my questions so completely. So thank you.
Hey, no worries. And just speaking to what you said, that's another thing that we talk about. When we talk about relationships, the vast majority of societies throughout history have been polygamous. You have one man and many women. The vast majority of relationships throughout human history have been monogamous, or I should say cultural history, or at least serially monogamous. And that this is one of those wonderful things that now in this day and age we're kind of getting more comfortable with talking about, is things like the fact that having different relationships, having different kinds of relationships has been around for forever. Kink and freaky sex has been around forever. Like these different opinions and beliefs on what a relationship should and shouldn't look like have been around forever. And now there are people who are pan and poly and all sorts of every other way. And it's open relationships, or what, it's as long as it works for you, it's cool. And we're coming back to that more and more and more, that as long as it is, like I said before, adults that are consenting, it's great. And it's probably happened before. And if we actually quantify what we would call unorthodox, out of the box, abnormal sexual relationship behaviors, it accounts for about 50% of all people. So we try, as you know, especially with early anthropology and scientists, to come in and be like, oh, we're gonna boil this down and knock off all the rough edges and try to get to the foundations of human sex and sexuality, and we end up eliminating half of the human population. And so it's just, you know, it's a wonderful thing that we get to go back and revisit these numbers and find out that they don't mean shit.